Hey y'all, welcome back. I have decided that I'm going to split up the video that I made for the Ready to Renovate Virtual Summit. It's really lengthy, about 40 minutes, and I feel like a lot of people come to my page with one specific question on water damage, and I think it's going to make it easier for those of you who are looking for specific areas of water damage to kind of navigate where that's at. So this video is going to be specifically for repairing your floor. So if you've got floor damage, definitely go ahead and watch, like and subscribe, and y'all message me with any questions you may have. Hope this is helpful. Now, I've tried to simplify this in the best way possible, so I broke water damage repairs down into 6 categories. So these principles will be used for all types of repairs, and they're really the core of all water damage repair. I'll go into each one of these in more detail, but the 6 R's of water damage include resealing your camper, removing the damaged wood, reframing, reconfiguring your electrical, R13, which is a type of insulation, and then replace, which is adding new paneling or OSB. Now, before you think about starting on repairs, you need to make sure that the leak has stopped and there's no more water intrusion. So you need to locate where the water is coming in and then reseal that area. Common places for leaks are windows, exterior lights, and basically all corners and edges of the camper. As you can see in this picture, the water was coming in from the roof in this little gap right there and was leaking all the way down into the ceiling and created a pretty nice soft spot in the ceiling that I had to replace. So that's all it takes is one small gap to have some pretty extensive damage. Now next, you're going to want to remove any rotten wood or insulation. Make sure to take a picture of your framing so you can have an idea of how it all goes back together. A multi-tool is really great for cutting in tight spaces where you're kind of trimming off the rotten wood of your framing. And it's going to help you control your cuts and not dig into the aluminum or fiberglass siding. You'll also want to clean up your studs, trusses, or joists by removing any nails, staples, or glue from your frame. Now, after all of your damaged wood and framing is removed, you're going to want to rebuild your frame. I usually like to work piece by piece until all the framing is repaired. Definitely refer back to that picture that you took of your framing so you can have an idea of how it all goes back together. So basically, I measured the dimensions of my original framing and ripped down 2x4s to that same size to rebuild it. I use overlapping and stagger joints to join the new wood into the existing framing. I'll go into more detail about what I call a buddy joint in a few minutes, so definitely keep that in the back of your mind. Now, if you're repairing frame damage, most likely you will have to reroute and reconfigure your electrical wires. So campers have a 12 volt and 120 volt system. Basically, your 12 volt wires are going to be really small. Your 120 volt wires are going to be much larger. They're usually encased in white or yellow, as you can see in the picture. There's both in that picture, and the 120 volt will have 3 separate wires in them. There's going to be a black, a white, and then there's a copper for the ground. So you'll be able to tell the difference if it's a 12 or 120 volt. Now, do your best not to cut the wires, especially if it's 120 volt. Try to feed them back through the wall or the floor or wherever if possible, and then reroute them to where they need to go. But if you have to cut them, I highly recommend that you learn how to solder. I do have a video on my YouTube about how to solder wires back together, but there's lots of good videos all over YouTube about soldering wires. And my main reasoning for that is you don't want to have to be digging through your wall or your ceiling or your floors because your wire nut came off and your wires aren't connected anymore and something's not working. So if it's going in anything that I'm not going to be able to get to easily, always solder it. Now, always feed your electrical through the framing. Never add paneling or floor or ceiling directly on top of electrical wires because then you run the risk of pinching it, and then you're definitely going to have some electrical issues after that. Now, I like to use R13 insulation. It is inexpensive and it works really well. So floors and ceilings will use a full roll of insulation, and for the walls, you'll need to tear the thickness in half. So your last step is going to be to replace. You're going to add a new piece of paneling or OSB over the framing that you just repaired. Basically measure and draw out your piece, cut it, test fit it, and then use construction adhesive and to glue the wood onto the frame, and then you can use staples or screws to secure it. Now, this is very important. If you don't listen to anything else in this entire presentation, listen to this slide. So first, you're going to make sure that your camper is unplugged and your battery is disconnected. You can even go as far as flipping your breakers off just to be safe. My reasoning for that is because you don't want to electrocute yourself, because chances are you will be dealing with electricity, your wires, all that fun stuff. So unplug your camper, don't electrocute yourself. Next, always try to work in 4x8 sections, always. So campers are built using 4x8 sheets, and it's a lot easier to replace the whole panel than it is to cut small sections out and try to repair it that way. It's also going to make your camper look like there was never any water damage at all if you repair it based on the dimensions that the manufacturer built on. Last, always split the framing when repairing water damage. Well, what does that mean? Let me show you a few examples. So let's look at a wall first. You can see the highlighted areas where the studs are, which are evenly spaced 4 feet apart. When you go to reinstall a new panel, the edge of one side will be nailed to the right half of the stud where my white arrow is, while the other side of the panel will be nailed to the left side of this other stud, which is the other white arrow. Next, we have a picture of the floor. If you look at the highlighted areas, you'll see that I made my cuts so only half of the joists were exposed. That way the original wood can still rest on the left half of the joist, which is the arrow in red, and my new piece can rest on the right half of the joist, which is the arrow in white. Now the same principle applies to the ceiling. So in this picture, half of the ceiling panel will rest towards the front of the camper on this truss right here, and then half of it will rest towards the back of the camper. So if you look on the roof, the trusses will be spaced evenly so the OSB can rest on each half of the trusses. So you guessed it, 4 feet apart. In this example, half of the OSB will rest on the right side of the truss where my white arrow just is, and the other half will rest on the front support that's highlighted in yellow, and there's also a white arrow right there. Okay, now that we have some basics of repairing water damage, we'll go into each specific category. So we're going to start with floors because it's the easiest, and we'll work our way all the way up to the roof. Now these are some basic materials you need to repair water damage on your floor. Keep in mind that the 5/8 inch OSB may not be what size your subfloor is, so make sure to measure how thick your specific camper subfloor is and buy the materials to match. You'll also need a full sheet of R13 and some deck screws. You can really use any screws that you want, but I like the deck screws because they sink well if you drill a pilot hole, and they're made for outside, so if you ever do have water damage later on, then your screws are not going to rust, and it just makes it a lot easier to take it all back apart. So as you can see, this floor had some pretty significant water damage. This is actually the floor from the video that I showed y'all at the beginning of the presentation. So first I determined the leak was coming from a piece of trim that wasn't caulked on the exterior of the camper, right about there where that yellow just showed up. So whenever it would rain, the water would just come down the front of the camper and basically go directly into the floor for a long time. Now the first thing I do is look for that 4-foot seam because I like to work in 4x8 sections. So relative to where the water damage is, in this case, it makes the most sense for me to remove the whole 4x8 section and then trim off the excess rot that are towards the walls. So if you see the yellow that just popped up, you see there's a line going down the middle of the floor there. That is my 4-foot section. So I ended up removing all of that. So basically, to remove the flooring, I just use my circular saw set to a little bit more than 5/8 of an inch, and just cut some straight lines. So I go a little bit past where the water damage is because the wood could still be wet even though it doesn't look rotten. So there's my first section I did, which is 4 by roughly 8. It's a little shorter than 8. But then in the white, you see there's 2 sections right there that I cut that I went a little further. It didn't make much sense for me to do another 4x8 sheet, so I did those 2 smaller sections right there. After my subfloor was removed, I used my multi-tool to cut off the rot and the wet wood that was on the joists. In this case, I had to cut my electrical wires because they were fed through the joists, and it actually went to the slide, and I didn't want to feed them up through the floor in the slide, so I just ended up cutting them. It was a lot easier. So now that all of my rot was out, I basically measured the dimensions of my original floor joist and ripped a bunch of 2x4s to the same size. Now I started around the edges under the walls and then worked my way towards the middle of the camper. Be sure to replace the anchor bolts if you're repairing any damage underneath the frame of the walls. I cut the old bolts off with an angle grinder and then added new bolts by drilling a hole from the outside frame up into the camper. So I had anchor bolts right here, and then there was one right there, and right there, and then one right there. So they basically hold the walls to the steel frame of the camper. So definitely make sure to replace those. If you look at the yellow highlighted areas, this is where I created a buddy joint that I was telling you guys about before, where my old joist will meet my new joist. So I use pocket holes to initially join the 2 pieces of wood, which are the areas in the arrows in white right there is where I have my pocket holes. And then I used a really long scrap piece of the same size to screw into the new and the old joist as additional support. So if you look at the arrows in green, that is where I put screws in to join that long piece from my old joist to my new joist. I also fed my electrical wires back through the joist and soldered the wires back together. So again, I highly recommend soldering if you don't know how to do this. There's a bunch of really good videos on YouTube on soldering, and I didn't want to have to mess with, take a risk of it not working, especially since it was the slide. Now, after your framing is complete and repaired, you will add a full roll of R13 insulation. You basically just measure and cut your new piece of subfloor after that and install using pilot holes and deck screws. I do not use construction adhesive on flooring, but you're more than welcome to if that's what you want to do.